Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming to today's Policy Forum. I'm Sabina Henneberg, Soref Fellow in the Linda and Tony Rubin Program on Arab Politics here at the Washington Institute. Today, we are going to talk about countering Russian and Chinese influence in North Africa. Today's event comes at a time when Tunisian President Kais Saied and Libya's Tripoli-based Prime Minister Abdelhamid Dbeibeh were both recently in Beijing for the China-Arab States Cooperation Forum meeting. Additionally, on June 17th, two Russian military ships reportedly arrived in the Libyan port of Tobruk, part of an apparent increase in cooperation between Russia and the eastern-based forces of General Khalifa Haftar. These are just a couple examples of clear and growing Russian and Chinese activity in North Africa. Moreover, this week's NATO summit, where Russia figures prominently on the agenda and where China is of growing concern to the alliance, highlights the long-term need for a unified strategy towards NATO's south, including North Africa. Today's event is meant to launch a recently published policy note co-authored by myself and several Institute colleagues, three of whom will join us for the second part of today's event. Before we begin, here is an overview of what to expect and how you can participate. First, I'm delighted that U.S. Ambassador to Tunisia, Joey Hood, will start us off with keynote remarks about countering Russian and Chinese influence in North Africa, tailoring his discussion to his experience on the ground in Tunisia over the last 1.5 years. This will be followed by an approximately 45-minute panel discussion moderated by me and posing questions to three of the paper's authors. If you would like to ask questions of our panelists during the event, please enter them into the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Or if you are watching this policy forum on our website or YouTube, feel free to email your questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. So for the first part of our event, I will introduce Ambassador Hood. Ambassador Joey Hood brings a wealth of experience around the Middle East. Prior to being confirmed by the U.S. Senate as ambassador to Tunisia in December 2022, he served in leadership positions in the State Department's Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, including as acting assistant secretary from January to September 2021. He also served as deputy chief of mission in Kuwait and Iraq, among other posts. Ambassador Hood, thank you very much for joining us today. Over to you.
Thank you, Sabina. I'd like to begin by thanking the Washington Institute for inviting me to speak with everyone today. I'd also like to compliment the authors on a thorough and useful review of the strategic importance of North Africa to the United States, to our European partners, and to competitors like Russia and the People's Republic of China, or the PRC. I also appreciate the authors' policy recommendations, many of which we have a head start on here in Tunisia. As the U.S. ambassador to Tunisia, as Sabina mentioned, my responsibility is for the bilateral relationship, so my remarks will reflect exclusively on the U.S. government's 227-year relationship with this country. In that context, I'd like to take issue with one of your paper's assertions, which is that, quote, North Africa has never been a top policy priority for the United States, unquote. And yet, no less than our second president, John Adams, urged the government to conclude treaties with Morocco, Algiers, Tripoli, and Tunis. So our first treaty of friendship and commerce with Tunisia was signed in 1797, and our first consulate here was opened in 1800. I'm sure I don't need to remind this august gathering that the new U.S. government's first overseas conflict also took place right here in North Africa. And then 2 centuries later, the Allies defeated the Nazis in Tunisia a country Hitler had ordered Rommel to hold at all costs. 70 years later, the United States provided vital weapons, equipment, training, and intelligence to the Tunisian armed forces to help them defeat ISIS here. And so at many turns since the adoption of our constitution in 1789, North Africa has in fact been a top policy priority for the United States. We frequently say that relationships have stood the test of time, but for the United States and Tunisia, that's actually true. But how does that bilateral relationship distinguish itself compared to others? That's what brings us back to the topic of this policy forum. North Africa in an era of so-called great power competition, challenges and opportunities for the United States. So allow me to provide a bird's eye view of how one global power, the United States, approaches its relationship with one of these important regional powers, Tunisia. Your paper recommended focusing on economic and livelihood issues. That's great. Let's look at the facts. Tunisia runs a trade surplus with the United States of over $300 million a year. And you know what we're buying? We are the biggest importer of Tunisian handicrafts in the world. The United States is also Tunisia's second largest international buyer of bottled olive oil. We also import high-end electronics, electrical components, and clothing. In fact, many of the most famous US brands are manufactured right here. These Tunisian exports support thousands of jobs in agriculture, traditional crafts, and manufacturing, and none of that is by accident. US assistance programs over the past decade have helped businesses working in these sectors expand and increase their exports by preparing for and entering major markets like the United States. And in that way, we've helped Tunisian businesses create more than 80,000 jobs in a little over a decade. We've also helped 44,000 small businesses directly, primarily in underserved regions. Your paper also recommended that the US government help Tunisia mitigate the effects of climate change. So in fact, a few years ago, we launched a $5 million investment in agricultural vocational centers to help farmers and beekeepers learn how to adapt to climate change. This year, we set aside up to $35 million through USDA to invest in the date sector. That's going to help farmers adapt to drier conditions, boost their production, and export even more dates to markets like the United States. We also launched this year a $7 million project in coordination with Virginia Tech to help fishers and farmers adapt to changing sea and land temperatures with the use of new technology. And as part of that, we're setting up a natural disaster management system with the Ministry of Agriculture. Our Power Tunisia project, which is being implemented by USAID, is mobilizing $70 million in investments to help more than 1,700 businesses convert to renewable energy, which will not only contribute to Tunisia's energy independence, but will also permit those companies to meet the EU's more stringent environmental requirements for imported products starting in 2026. That's one way, as you recommend in your paper, that the US and European governments are working in concert. Your paper also recommended that we boost private sector development of advanced technologies. Well, private sector businesses are already doing this to a certain extent in order to take advantage of arrangements like the free trade agreement between Tunisia and the EU, as well as the tremendous human resources here. Worldwide, Tunisia is second only to Malaysia in its percentage of STEM graduates. It also has twice the percentage of women in scientific research than the United States. And companies have noticed all this. That's why Visteon, a $4 billion American automotive parts company, recently expanded its operations here by opening a high-tech manufacturing plant. I just returned from a trip to Sousse, which is Tunisia's third largest city, where we sponsored a hackathon and a pitch competition for women-led tech startups to help build the ecosystem on which companies like Visteon depend to expand their operations even further. You called for the Tunisian American Enterprise Fund, also known as TIFE, to be reinvigorated, but its model is so simple, I'm not sure anything could be done to invigorate it further. TIFE has invested $100 million in Tunisian small and medium enterprises, and those investments are now beginning to earn revenue. That revenue will then be used to fund a US-Tunisian foundation whose activities will be determined by a joint board of directors. And so I suppose that's where next we can turn our attention. Your paper rightly highlighted the importance of the US-Tunisian security partnership. That really can't be overstated. A decade ago, extremists targeted this country for their next big conquest. They tried to take territory in the coastal town of Ben Garden near the Libyan border. They tried to disrupt the tourism sector through terrorist attacks. And they heavily recruited Tunisian youth to fight in foreign countries with promises of glory that, of course, ended in nightmares for thousands of families. US partnership with the Tunisian military and the Ministry of Interior Security Forces helped bring an end to all that. And our partnership continues to contribute to security and stability, not just in Tunisia, but in the region as a whole. In 2023, we provided Tunisia more than $160 million worth of security assistance, bringing in everything from night vision goggles to C-130 aircraft to facilitate Tunisia's UN peacekeeping operation support across the continent, as well as humanitarian and disaster recovery efforts and training in Tunisia for African partners. We've worked with partners like Germany to provide over $138 million in funding so far to help the Ministry of Defense develop a border surveillance capability along its eastern land border. I'm glad to say the project is now 2/3 of the way to completion, and we're working with European partners to secure funding for the final phase. That's by no means an exhaustive list of our activities, but I wanted to provide you a detailed look at some of the work we're doing every day in the areas that your paper recommended engagement in. And I think what I've described here is a stark contrast to the approach of Russia and the PRC. For example, I mentioned Tunisia's trade surplus with the United States. Well, Tunisia runs massive trade deficits with both those other countries. Russia sells Tunisia fuel and wheat at world market prices. It certainly doesn't give these things away. And the PRC exports consumer products to Tunisia, just like it does pretty much everywhere else in the world. And yet these countries import very little from Tunisia, despite the availability of the world-class products and services I mentioned a few minutes ago. There's really nothing to distinguish these trading relationships. And I see very little in terms of real support to Tunisia's students, businesses, civil society, or institutions along the lines of what I described the United States is doing. Meanwhile, as you point out, the Wagner Group and the so-called Africa Corps fuel conflicts that degrade security on this continent and fuel migration northward. And these are all concerns we share with our Tunisian partners. Here again, US investments in our bilateral security partnership are paying dividends. Let me reiterate, thanks to our assistance, Tunisia is not only more secure and stable, but it's more capable of supporting UN peacekeeping operations, as well as humanitarian and disaster relief efforts all across the continent of Africa. And it's doing these things. This isn't just potential. These are things that Tunisia is doing day in and day out. And they do it a lot cheaper than we can do. Increasingly, with our help, Tunisia is also serving as a training hub for partners across the continent, as a leading partner for security in Africa. Now, Tunisia is, of course, a sovereign country that's free to pursue its own relations and its own interests, just as the United States does. And we want to help it do so from a position of strength. So in that vein, I'd love to scale up everything that we're doing by an order of magnitude if funding were available for that. But in the meantime, I think our current engagement strategy aligns with much of what you've recommended and what is working. Private sector-led economic growth, working closely with our European partners to support security and stability, while addressing long-term vulnerabilities like climate change. If we focus on the facts and the results, rather than just photo opportunities that others may favor, you'll see that the US-Tunisian cooperation is delivering for people in both countries. So I don't think we have anything to fear from Russian or PRC competition in Tunisia. So far, it just isn't there when you look at the facts. And when we do have questions or concerns, we have the open channels of communication we need to talk about those with our Tunisian partners, frankly. So thank you for the opportunity to talk with you, frankly, today. And thanks again for your focus on this strategically vital region. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Hood, for those very helpful insights and that overview of how the U.S. partnership in Tunisia is strengthening its economy and livelihoods, in a deeper and more effective way than the PRC, helping mitigate effects of climate change, supporting the private sector, and continuing a longstanding security relationship that is also helping counter the influence of Russia's Wagner Group across Africa. Now we'll move into the second portion of today's event. I'll begin by introducing our three panelists. Anna Borshevskaya is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute's Diane and Guilford Glaser Foundation program on great power competition in the Middle East. Ben Fishman is the Stephen D. Levy Fellow in the Institute's Linda and Tony Rubin program on Arab politics. And Grant Rumley is the Meisel Goldberger Senior Fellow at the Institute's Glaser Foundation on Great Power Competition in the Middle East. Before turning to our panelists, I'm going to briefly address the question of why North Africa matters for U.S. security. As Ambassador Hood noted, the U.S. has long recognized the importance of relationships in North Africa. North Africa presents several geographical and other features that warrant attention from Washington. The region sits at a crossroads of the Middle East, Africa, and Europe, and boasts vast energy resources, including renewable resources such as solar and wind. Its stability has come under threat in recent years, as Libya remains mired in internal conflict. Tunisia's democratic experiment appears to have come to a crashing halt, and relations between Algeria and Morocco are at an all-time low. Yet North Africa's stability is of vital importance to our partners in Europe, where the effects of migration from North Africa are already being acutely felt. It is for these reasons that we teamed up over the past year to study the roles of Russia and China in North Africa, in each of these four North African countries, in the diplomatic, economic, security, and cultural spheres. One of our key takeaways is that the U.S. doesn't need to compete everywhere. We can be smart and targeted. North Africa is a notoriously fragmented region, making it particularly vulnerable to malign influence. In addition to pursuing policies that promote regional integration, the U.S. should also use tailored strategies in each country to help fortify and develop our partnerships there. I'm now going to turn to the panelists to discuss in more depth what Russian and Chinese influence in North Africa looks like and how the U.S. can respond to or preempt it. For this first round of questions, I'll ask you to each limit your remarks to 5 minutes. Grant, let's start with you. U.S., Russian, and Chinese security relationships across North Africa are highly varied. Can you describe the key areas of vulnerability and influence in terms of security relations in each country?
Sure. Thanks so much, Sabina. Thanks for emceeing this. Thanks to Ambassador Hood for participating today and for his remarks. That's not the first time I've been given a gentle history reminder from Ambassador Hood, and I dare say it won't be the last. So I always appreciate hearing his perspective on U.S. relations abroad, in particular in this important region. You know, from a security standpoint, what I would say is I think North Africa, like many countries around the world, is grappling with the turbulence of the overall security environment the past few years, namely the second and third order effects from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so on top of all of the North African countries' regional concerns, the instability in the Sahel, the ongoing conflict in Libya, tensions between Algeria and Morocco, there are also the effects of the war in Ukraine. Not only is this a state-on-state conflict on a scale that hasn't been seen in many years, it also is a change in the international arms market. Russia was, before the war, one of the top arms exporters around the world. things have dramatically shifted over 2 years into this war, and it's affected North Africa. I think if you were a country that is broadly aligned with the U.S. and Western countries in support of Ukraine, you found yourselves grappling with a scenario where not only are the U.S. and Western countries asking you to offload military equipment in support of Ukraine, but you're also seeing defense budgets rise accordingly, defense spending rise accordingly. You're seeing turnover in material, and you're also seeing that a lot of these countries that you've looked to supply and kit your own militaries prioritize arms sales in different directions, whether that's towards Europe, towards Ukraine, towards the Indo-Pacific. You've seen sort of the international makeup shift that way. On the other end of the spectrum, if you are a country that has broadly aligned with Russia or the Soviet Union before that and relied on Moscow to train, equip, and source your military, you found that after the invasion, that's incredibly difficult. Countries like India, like Egypt, have found that not only is it hard to buy new Russian material, it's difficult to maintain and sustain the existing Russian material that you have in your militaries. And so North Africa is home to two countries that embody that sort of spectrum there, with a Morocco that has generally relied on the U.S. in the past, and Algeria, which has overwhelmingly relied on Russia in the past to source its military. And so I think, these considerations are going to be a major factor in where the North African countries look to align with, to help advance their own security interests. And it's a reminder to the U.S., as Ambassador Hood pointed out, that while the focus is undoubtedly on Ukraine and on the Indo-Pacific and China and Taiwan right now, that there are these countries that feel the reverberations of this shift in focus and have their own security considerations that we need to be cognizant of.
Thank you. Ben, building particularly on the question of Russia in North Africa, Deputy Russian Defense Minister Yunus Betyevkurov has made numerous visits to Libya over the past year, meeting with various members of the Haftar family, whose Libyan National Army controls much territory in the country's east and south. What are Russia's interests in Libya, and what makes Libya so susceptible to Russian encroachment? How can Russian encroachment be contained?
Well, I'll leave it to Anna to describe the broader Russian interest in this region. But frankly, I think as an immediate threat, the growing alliance between Russia and Haftar, I think, bodes the most significant threat to the U.S. and broadly NATO. Especially now that Russia is, since the demise of Prigozhin and Wagner, overtly developing this relationship. Now, the Haftar in Russia is more. 2017 was basically the moment where Wagner started this relationship, and it grew significantly where Russia participated in the 2019-2020 civil war with Russian snipers and drones against Tripoli. And now that it's an overt relationship, Russia has access to Haftar's control of the East, air bases significantly, and air bases, naval bases. This recent port visit that unloaded God knows how many weapons and material to Haftar and Benghazi, mostly to be set forward to probably Sahel and broader interests in Russia. So it's really a matter of growing influence. Haftar not only was seen to meet the deputy defense minister, but also had access to Putin. Now, what does Russia want with Libya? It's obviously the military bases. It's access to oil that Haftar controls, and driving migration that Ambassador Hood referred to. And we're doing very little, I think, to counter this problem. So, what are we actually doing? With all due respect to our diplomats, it's not sufficient to meet occasionally with Haftar to basically urge him to stop this relationship. And frankly, it's a minimal effort. Now, what can be done? We've had the opportunity to sanction him for several years on a variety of sanctions, including Magnitsky, including the sanctions about disturbing and this peace in Libya that went into effect in the early Obama administration. And I think should revisit it, especially with Haftar's sons, if not him directly. And the COTSA sanctions now, I think, could be another avenue, because obviously they're reliant on growing weapons in Russia. So there's other things I think that we can discuss and think about countering Russia in that region. But it's really important now to think about this strategy, and more of, with all due respect to Ambassador Hood too, it just reflects, I think, the disproportionate relationship that Russia is taking seriously with Libya, and our lack of attention to the same thing. So I think this is a critical area that we need to focus more on.
Well, thank you. Anna, if you would like to expand on Russia's particular interests and objectives in Libya, that would be welcome. Welcome addition to Ben's helpful remarks. And secondly, I was also going to ask you about one of Russia's key tools of influence, which is the use of misinformation and disinformation to influence public opinion. This tool is not unique to North Africa, so maybe you can talk about how Russia's use of this tool compares to other countries in the Middle East.
Sure. Thank you very much, Sabina. I'll see if I can incorporate all of these comments in questions, but in order to do that, I'll start with a brief overview of the big picture, and then zoom in on issues like Libya and disinformation. Let me start by saying what it is that Russia is looking to do in this region, and how it fits within Russia's bigger geostrategic calculus. Russia is looking to change the international system. Russia wants to see a different world order globally, and in particular, it wants a renegotiation of the European security architecture. This has been a longstanding Russian goal, but it is the invasion of Ukraine that has highlighted it with the most stark clarity. And of course, several of us have already mentioned Ukraine as part of this discussion. To that end, let me add a little bit more insofar as it relates specifically to North Africa, and that is the current NATO summit that is starting in Washington tomorrow. Of course, as Sabina mentioned, Ukraine remains the most urgent priority for NATO, but the bigger issue in terms of how to help Ukraine, and there is a realization now within NATO leadership in particular, that in order to counter Russia in Ukraine, NATO must go beyond Ukraine. And this includes not NATO, but the West in particular. So specifically, it is countering NATO's South. And North Africa is part of NATO's so-called southern region. So for that reason, this region is incredibly important. And as I think several of us have already mentioned, the case of Russian influence is a case of a slow-moving building influence. In other words, it's not an immediate urgent threat the way we're seeing it in Ukraine, but it is long-standing. It's been building up for many years before Russia's invasion, and frankly, even before Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. So in terms of the big picture, this is what Russia's interests are. Now, and Russia is competing with the United States globally. This is a global game for Russia, and therefore it's critical that the United States looks at competing with Russia with the same global calculus and looks to counter Russia in these strategic areas outside of Ukraine. So, with that, let me turn to Libya to follow up to build up on Ben's points. I agree with everything he said. Let me just say also that the reason why, in particular, access to a port in Libya is important for Russia is not for its own sake, but where it fits in a bigger geostrategical picture. So if you think about the map where Russia already has naval access in Syria, in Tartus, on the Eastern Mediterranean, Russia already has a lot of influence in Egypt. There's an arc of influence that goes towards Libya. So it is a case of Russia's historic long-standing drive to build military influence on the strategically vital Eastern Mediterranean, which is also helping bolster its war on Ukraine. Libya offers deep water port access. So in other words, it offers, which is something that it cannot get in Syria, depending on how you define that deep water port. Syria is typically defined as a shallow water port. So in terms of logistics, Libya simply offers more. And in fact, Joseph Stalin, to go a little bit more into history, sought to get access for the Soviet Union in this port after World War II negotiations, but in that particular endeavor, he had failed. I bring this up as an example, again, of how long of a historic trend there is for Russia to vie for influence in this region. And of course, in addition to that, Libya's complicated, fragmented politics offer an incredible opportunity to gain access to oil, energy influence, but also it's a deeper window into the rest of Africa. And this is another important strategic point. Putin said, I believe in 2013, even prior to annexation of Crimea, that Africa cannot be on the periphery of international relations. And on that, I think Washington should believe him. In other words, Putin has long identified Africa as an important strategic pivot for Russia. And so where does disinformation fit in? Disinformation is a tool. It's a tool to achieve a larger purpose. And what Russia is trying to do with disinformation is to shape the narrative, to shape perceptions, to take control over discussion. Narratives, we may discount them as important or unimportant because with Russia in particular, they're often not based on facts. And we tend to deal with facts in the West. But a perception often matters more than reality. And somebody who can shape the perception can very much gain an upper hand in terms of a debate. And this is especially true in this part of the world. So by and large, Russia's toolkit remains largely the same. What we do see is more of use of Wagner in particular in this part of the world, in particular in Libya, which Ben has already mentioned. And that is simply the fact that Wagner has been a useful tool for Russia, and the Kremlin has been able to utilize it as sort of a tip of a spear in its warfare. And narrative disinformation is part of warfare. It has been historically for any country. Frankly, here Russia is no different. And it is, and we have seen Wagner used more in this part of the globe than in other parts where Russia has employed disinformation campaigns. But by and large, these cases are very much varied. I can go into more specific examples. They do have to do with each particular environment, and Russia very much tailors its disinformation message to its environment. It's quite good at figuring that out. So let me end there because I'm out of time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Staying in the security realm for a moment, another moment, Grant, how can the U.S. convince the countries of North Africa of the risks of deepening security ties with China? It would be interesting to hear about examples of where Washington has successfully done this or not elsewhere in the Middle East. And what are the risks if Washington does not succeed in preventing the deepening of such ties?
Thanks so much, Sabina. I mean, I think I would broaden it out a little bit and say I think North African countries, like a lot of U.S. partners around the world, are experiencing sort of a whiplash moment when it comes to great power competition in the global landscape. For many years, going back to the late Cold War, the sort of overarching thrust of the U.S. approach to China was that through economic engagement, investment, outsourcing manufacturing, political engagement, diplomatic engagement, that you could sort of identify a middle of the Venn diagram between the US and China, where China was part of the international system. And yes, they had sort of a different style of governance, but they were still sort of operating within the overall confines of the international system and the established international order, and that there would be sort of a path for some type of mutual harmony. I think over the past few years, China's actions have disabused the U.S. and its partners of that notion. You see that manifest itself in the policies of the previous administration with regards to China being by and large promulgated and carried on into the Biden administration. There is bipartisan consensus in the U.S. about the nature of the competition with China and the subsequent risks that a relationship a third party country might have with China poses to the U.S. And so, obviously, North Africa is a strategic avenue for this competition. It's important to China. China features North African countries in its multilateral fora with the region. It's typically the first stop for Chinese foreign ministers. The Chinese foreign minister in 2018 described sort of a vision of Chinese industrial park port network that would go from the Middle East into the Mediterranean. And so it's a key feature there. And I think as Ambassador Hood illustrated, we can have this whole range of economic and security ties to a country, North Africa, like we do with Tunisia, but also we can see the Tunisian head of state visiting Beijing and looking to deepen avenues of cooperation there. And so it is still very much an active competition. I think from a U.S. standpoint, it's really about our messaging and what we can provide for U.S. partners. I think what they're looking for first and foremost from a security standpoint is transparency and professionalism and a better understanding of the parameters of a relationship with China. Part of this is simply the U.S. just has to do our own homework and get our own house in order. If you asked the Defense Department what constitutes crossing a red line vis-a-vis a security relationship with China, you may get a different answer from the Pentagon than you would from the State Department or from the White House. And so for a lot of countries, the messaging they hear from the U.S. isn't always of one voice. But if we were able to sort of look on a country by country basis, take into account a country's contextual relationship with China, and then incorporate that into our own risk assessment vis-a-vis their relationship with China and our existing security relationship with them, and then speak with one voice about sort of the left-right limits of a relationship with China, I think that would go a long way in sort of standardizing and laying out there for countries that, okay, if you host Chinese forces or buy advanced Chinese technology, that will preclude certain levels of security cooperation with the US. We are still looking to provide that for you and partner with you, but you have to understand here are sort of our limits. For countries that are not a U.S. partner and are more neutral in the region, let's say, for instance, in Algeria, obviously, the messaging isn't necessarily here are all the benefits to security cooperation with the U.S. Don't do X, Y, Z with China. But I think we can sort of frame it as an issue of sovereignty. And so for the longest time, our messaging was, don't partner with China because it's bad and we don't want you to do it. And many countries around the world looked at the U.S. and looked at the tenor and tone of our positions vis-a-vis China, and concluded that we're not exactly an unbiased actor in that regard. I think in shifting the messaging towards you should not, or you should be wary of deepening your cooperation with China because it poses a risk ultimately to your own sovereignty. That in cooperating with China in these critical sectors, you give Beijing a source of leverage over you at some point, given the nature of the state-owned and state-controlled enterprises emanating out of China, and that we do not want to see other countries around the world give that type of leverage to Beijing. And so I think that is an effective messaging that can also have reverberations in the security realm as well. Your final question was, sort of what are the risks in regards to a country's relationship with China and the U.S. I think it's the risk we run here is that we essentially create the space for a third party country, an adversary in this case, to put a cap on the security cooperation between the U.S. and a security partner. That simply through the nature of Chinese investment and presence abroad, there is a risk to intellectual property to sort of there's an intelligence risk, there's subsequent risk to U.S. forces from a collection standpoint. And so if the North Star in DC is the competition with China, and it will be for the foreseeable future, and if the way to navigate to that North Star is maintaining a technological and military edge vis-a-vis China, then that will always sort of trump any type of decision with regards to an arms sale or a training exercise or some type of security cooperation if a third party country has such a deep relationship with China. And so I think that's the risk to us, and the way to get out ahead of that is through clear, transparent messaging to our partners.
Thank you. Very encompassing observations. Now turning for a moment to the political and economic spheres, and then back to the information sphere. Ben, I wanted to ask you, North Africa's lack of political and economic integration appears to make it vulnerable to Chinese and Russian encroachment. How can the U.S. encourage integration among these countries? Also, can you talk about the risks of deepening economic ties between North Africa and China?
The lack of integration between Algeria and Morocco, which I think Secretary Clinton sought to briefly when the relationships weren't that bad, would itself open billions of dollars of trade. The closure of that border is really, really disadvantageous to the incorporation of the region. That's only the most significant example. There's a border closure in between Libya and Tunisia. There's a Tunisian economic trade with Algeria is a little bit, but I haven't, we need to check the numbers. But this is basically a trend that you've observed that needs to be worked on if fully economic integration will happen and will be advantageous for the rest of the region. Now, Libya, in my own research, and there's a UN paper on this, if it becomes stable and an economic source of stability with the oil wealth and production maximization, which is about 1.3 billion barrels a day, could be up to 2 million barrels a day, would benefit the whole region in terms of economic job creation. There's a UN study that says billions of dollars would be a flow throughout the region Europe, to Egypt. And that's the kind of thing that economic and political instability suffer from. Libya itself, just one comment again on Libya, the lack of development is astounding, economic development. Part of that is corruption, but part of it is lack of economic reform based on subsidies and public sector employment. But in a wealthy country with oil revenues, the country has, in 12, 13 years, has really built almost nothing. And they saw the disaster of this flood last year. And again, pointing to Haftar, there's been very little reconstruction despite the money and international attention to this. So that's one example of how corruption basically fails to deliver for the people, and it's basically a tragedy for the citizens of the region.
Thank you. Before turning to questions from the audience, Anna, I wanted to go back to you and ask, what tools does the U.S. have for countering Russian influence in the information sphere?
Sure, thank you very much, and I want to build on what Grant and Ben said. I don't want to repeat, but I do want to emphasize the point about messaging. One tool that the United States has, it can simply put more attention, not only more resources, but also more attention towards better messaging this region. For example, a lot of the things that Ambassador Hood has described in terms of what the United States does, in particular in Tunisia, is simply not very well known. And this is often the case with a lot of very good things that the United States does, because we prioritize real issues, and to use Ambassador's term, facts versus photo ops. But to give you another example, in Syria, when we distribute humanitarian aid, we oftentimes don't label humanitarian aid because we prioritize delivering aid to the people to whom it matters the most, rather than getting credit. And we know that if it's labeled, it is more likely to be targeted. So one tool this is one thing we can very much do. We can simply put more effort into more direct, clear, and unapologetic messaging of what we do. That's an important piece of a bigger strategy. What we can also do is partner more with local media outlets, which is what Russia does all throughout the Middle East. And finally, we can also do more to empower Ukrainians to project their own narrative in this region. And this has a long-term strategic purpose. And I bring this up because Ukrainians in particular have understood since Russia's invasion that they very much have their own narrative problem in this strategic, critical part of the world, which frankly has been affected by Russia's weaponization of food, Russia's using wheat as a weapon, in particular in this part of the world. It affects North Africa much more than the rest of the world. And Ukrainians themselves have been opening embassies all across Africa to project their narrative. This is something that we can very much help them with. And while it may not have a direct impact, it very much would tailor to our strategic larger objectives in countering Russia. And those are the three top recommendations that I have. I'll end there. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We do have a few questions from the audience, a couple specifically about Libya, which has been a big focus in this morning's panel. So I'll go ahead and direct those to Ben, but of course anyone else can chime in. So one question is, what can the US and its European allies do in Libya to ensure that any actions are not perceived as an outside imposition. And this fits well with our theme of perceptions and information strategies. And a second question is whether countering Haftar through some of the tools you mentioned, like sanctions, will be sufficient for countering Russian and Chinese influence in Libya.
Both good questions. For the first one about outside intervention, that's been an issue from the get-go, from the actual outside intervention in 2011 to any kind of assistance or diplomatic engagement since then. But I remain convinced that for the majority of Libyans, they welcome U.S. Support, and they actually want more of that. And the perceived European intervention, they have greater suspicions of France, Italy, for various colonial past endeavors. So this conflict between our capabilities, our interests, and our investment. Fortunately, there's some good news because most countries, Europeans, Russia, have full-fledged embassies in Libya. We are just starting from 2014. We have had just a presence in Libya, Tunisia. Now, finally, we're with the cooperation of Congress. We're establishing a presence, not a full embassy, but a full-time presence in Libya, and that will help. With Haftar, I remain convinced, and this is a debate that the U.S. government has had since 2015 and more directly in 2019 and 20, when he was actively supporting, and Russians were actively supporting, and he invaded Tripoli. Many of us in the outside world or outside Washington analytical community were urging sanctions. There was an internal debate about sanctioning him, and the internal debate within the administration. Obviously, that didn't happen, and I think you really need to revisit that issue now. And there are other tools that can be exploited countering Russia. And this is basically a subject of Anna's work in terms of basically countering Russia, not just in the region, but what can be done writ large to their growing influence in the Mediterranean.
Okay, thank you. We also have a question about one of the themes in our paper, but that hasn't come up much yet in our discussion, and that's climate change. How does climate change figure in to countering Russian and Chinese presence in North Africa? How is it either an advantage or a threat for the U.S. and U.S. influence there?
Sure, I'll address that briefly, and we do indeed go into more detail in our paper on this question. But what we say in the paper is that this region has suffered extensively from wildlife damage and earthquakes and flooding. And as climate change becomes a growing problem, such incidents are going to increase as well. So this region is particularly vulnerable to its impact. So one of the things we could do, and again, we talk about this in our paper, is to provide forums for better information exchange, for better practices, enhance cooperation. And here again, as the United States really has the tools to help far more than Russia and China. We just need to muster more of the willpower and resources to do it.
And I would just add that I think green energy has been an increasing focus from China for a couple of years now, sort of building off the Belt and Road Initiative into sort of new sectors, healthcare, technology, green energy. And so I don't think we've seen that sort of manifest itself in the Middle East on a grand scale yet, but I think it's certainly something that Beijing is looking to expand in a region that it's accurately identified as a pretty lucrative market for alternative energy and different capabilities that sort of mitigate the effects of climate change. And so it would behoove the U.S. To understand that and perhaps get out ahead of that with some of our own economic projects.
Excellent. Yeah, these have all been excellent interventions, and that last remark, Grant, segues a bit into one final general question that we've touched on a fair amount, and that is how we can more effectively partner with our European allies in North Africa. So we've talked about things like speaking with one voice about security concerns. If any of you have any last words to say on what else we can do specifically in cooperation with Europe to address some of these issues, we can close with that.
Maybe I'll start. There's a tension between us and the Europeans on migration specifically, and they feel it. We don't. So there's a natural lack of attention here, but and more profoundly in Europe. But I think there needs to be a dialogue at least to come to terms, because some of their activity, specifically in Libya, I don't know about Tunisia exactly, but they're Italy and Spain, and regarding Morocco, is destructive or disruptive to political stability. And in Libya particularly, there are these horrible conditions for migrants. It's a criminal activity too, and the government doesn't really do anything about it. And some of the militias profit from it. So at a minimum, we have to work with the Europeans on it. It also deals with climate change and because of the drivers of migration. But I don't get a sense that we're talking to them on this specific topic, and obviously we need to.
So if I could just build very quickly on what Ben said, because migration is such an important point. This is a key, one of the key issues to look at in the near future. Russia weaponizes migration flows. It exacerbates migration in these parts of the world into Europe, and it is in particular looking to hit Europe with a double wave of migration. Again, this is not a new thing; it's been going on since Russia's invasion of Ukraine and even prior. But this is how Russia is looking to destabilize Europe. In other words, not only will Europeans have to deal with Syrian, Ukrainian refugees, but also refugees from this part of the world. There is a broad recognition that this is a problem in our conversations with us and our European allies, but there's no recognition on how to fix it. So this is what we need to focus on, and this is very hard when you have a large when you have a large alliance. The same is true, by the way, of NATO, as it is looking to counter Russia in the south. There's a recognition that we need to do it, but no recognition on how to do it. And this is where we need to look to focus on how to do it, craft a unified strategy, and look for points of agreement. Lastly, and as a sub point to that, one of the things that Russia capitalizes on in this part of the world is the fact that Russia did not colonize Africa. it is using that point as part of its messaging and as part of its narrative control. We have been very bad, and Europeans have been fairly poor at responding to this narrative. So that's one thing we can agree on. That's one of the things we can build out as we look at other bigger strategic ways we can cooperate together. Thank you.
Well, I would just say, as Anna and Ben have pointed out, it's as much about the message as it is the messenger. And so I think the first line of effort is making sure that our messaging is harmonious with our European allies and partners, but then also understanding that between the US and Europe, given the history in North Africa, that some states are going to be more effective messengers than others. And so not only getting the overall top line message in sync, but also understanding who may be best to deliver that message is a key effort between the US and Europe.
Well, I've learned so much. Thanks to everybody again. Ben, Anna, Grant, thanks to everybody online. Thank you very much, Ambassador Hood. Goodbye.